Hello and welcome to this short look at I Hear an Army by James Joyce, which is one of the 15 poems in your English Literature GCSE anthology. James Joyce is probably best known for his prose writing rather than his poetry. He wrote a series of short stories called Dubliners, as well as a semi-autobiographical account of his own development as a writer called Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, and then his most celebrated and well-known work, Ulysses, which is widely considered to be one of the great works of English literature in the 20th century. Today, though, we're going to be looking, as I say, at this poem, I Hear an Army. And now, before we begin, I'm just going to draw your attention to some of the colour coding that I've done in turquoise. First of all, you've got words or phrases that I would broadly speaking group under the heading of auditory imagery. So these are words or phrases that appeal to our sense of hearing. Joyce makes quite significant and extensive use of such imagery. In yellow, we've got powerful verb choices that are often used to describe the motion of the army, the movement of the army, and the things that they do. And then finally in purple, we've got words or phrases that directly describe the army and help create an image of those in our mind. And hopefully you can see on the bottom right of the screen there's a key which just sort of makes clear, hopefully, what the different colour coding means. Next to that, on the bottom left, we've got an image of a charioteer. This is in the first stanza, one of the images that Joyce creates, so I thought it'd be useful to see what that actually looks like. It's not the most common mode of transport these days. And then just next to the charioteer, we have a blacksmith, and some of you may know he's using a hammer to hit an anvil, rather possibly a piece of metal placed on the anvil. So the anvil is that platform against which he can sort of hit and shape metal. So you can imagine that when the hammer hits the anvil, it creates quite a sort of powerful noise, one that Joyce in the second stanza describes as a clanging. Okay, so I'm going to just read the poem once through and then jump in and explore some of the language in a little bit more detail. I hear an army. I hear an army charging upon the land, and the thunder of horses plunging, foam about their knees. Arrogant, in black armour, behind them stand, disdaining the reins with fluttering whips, the charioteers. They cry unto the night their battle name. I moan and sleep when I hear afar their whirling laughter. They cleave the gloom of dreams, a blinding flame, clanging upon the heart as upon an anvil. They come shaking in triumph, their long green hair. They come out of the sea and run shouting by the shore. My heart, have you no wisdom thus to despair? My love, my love, my love, why have you left me alone? Okay, let's launch right in then to the first stanza. And the speaker of the poem says that he can hear an army charging upon the land. And I think it's interesting that immediately Joyce appeals to a sense of hearing rather than sight. The army currently, at least in that first line, appears to be sort of out of sight, but it can be heard, and we might think about what effect that creates. It's something that I think quite often used in horror films and the like to create that sense of sort of menacing anticipation. You can hear something approaching, you can't yet see it, so maybe that immediately creates a sort of sense of the army being quite a terrifying force. The sense of the overwhelming noise made by this army is definitely conveyed, I think, as well in that second line with the image, the metaphor of the thunder of horses. So we can imagine perhaps the hundreds or even thousands of hooves hitting the ground at the same time as these horses charge forwards, and the noise that would create similar perhaps to thunder and a thunderstorm. And certainly, if we look at the verb choices that Joyce uses, we can understand why this army is making such a loud noise as it charges forward. We get this verb charging, and then the horses plunging, both very sort of strikingly kind of active verbs. These are both quite violent, even we could say, movements being made by the army. Then in the third and fourth lines, rather than giving us this sort of zoomed out impression of the army as a whole, of all of these horses charging and plunging, Joyce focuses in on some of the members of this army, some of the soldiers, if you like, within this army. And particularly he's focusing on the Charioteers, so that is the people who are kind of driving these horses forwards and being pulled along in their chariots. And again, you might want to take a quick look at that image in the bottom left of a charioteer doing precisely that. Now, let's look at how Joyce describes these soldiers. So we can see, highlighted in purple, the description of the army. They are arrogant. So we might think about why that is. What gives them this arrogance? Are they always victorious? Are they so confident of victory? Are they so powerful that they can afford this arrogance, this sense of certainty, perhaps, of their victory? Not only that, but they're sort of clad in black armor, this sense of them being sort of protected or invulnerable, perhaps conveyed by that word armor. And we'd also consider maybe the connotations of the color black. Is Joyce asking us to associate this army with death, because that obviously is a connotation of that color black. So they are arrogant, they're wearing black armor, and behind them stands, so behind the horses, disdaining the reins with fluttering whips, are the Charioteers. Interesting to notice what the Charioteers are doing. They're disdaining the reins. In other words, they are ignoring, not using the reins on the horse. And reins generally, I suppose, would be used to slow down a horse or control a horse. But these Charioteers ignore that aspect. They don't want to slow down the horses. Instead, they're using fluttering whips. This word, verb fluttering, is quite interesting because it conveys, I think, that sense of the whips being in constant motion. Okay, there's no point at which these Charioteers are sort of hesitant or pausing or slowing down their horses. They're just constantly driving them forwards. Perhaps one other thing to point out here in lines 3 and 4 is the way that Joyce delays telling us exactly what the subject of his sentence is. So if you look again, it says, arrogant and black armor behind them, i.e. behind the horses, stand disdaining the reins with fluttering whips, the Charioteers. It's only at the very end of that fourth line that we actually learn what exactly he's describing. And I think this creates a sense of sort of ominous build-up as we wait to discover who or what is arrogant in black armor, who or what is disdaining the reins and sort of wielding these fluttering whips. And then we discover, bam, at the end of that fourth line, sort of great impact, that it's the Charioteers, the chariot riders in this army. And then just finally, before we move on to the second stanza, you'll notice that I've marked the rhyme scheme, and it's a fairly conventional A-B rhyme scheme. So land and stand rhyme, knees and charioteers. It's a bit of a sort of half rhyme, but certainly we have that extended E sound, and they both end with that S. So it's a fairly clear A-B rhyme scheme. We might think about what Joyce is intending there. Is it perhaps conveying some of the solid nature of this army? They are kind of marching forwards in this sort of very determined fashion, a bit like perhaps, we could say the rhyme scheme creates that clear sort of pattern in this first stanza. In the second stanza, we continue to build our sense of what this army is like, as the speaker tells us. They cry unto the night their battle name. So again, we have this quite powerful verb, and also it's an auditory image, isn't it, of them crying into the night. Now this isn't sort of crying as in tears, it's a cry, like a call, a shout, if you like, into the night. And what are they shouting? Well, they're shouting their battle name. So we aren't told exactly, what their battle name is, but we can imagine perhaps some type of terrifying war cry that they shout as they launch their attack. And we can see then in the second line of that middle stanza the effect that this has on the speaker. He says, I moan in sleep when I hear afar their whirling laughter. So we get perhaps in that word moan a sense of his emotions, his reaction to this army coming through. Is it a moan of fear, discomfort? What effect is this army having on him? It certainly doesn't seem to be particularly positive. And he says he can hear them from afar, and he hears their whirling laughter. We might sort of think about that description of the Charioteers as arrogant and connect that to this image of whirling laughter. Again, is it this sense of them being so confident in victory that they're able to laugh even as they go into battle? And whirling as well, I think, is quite an interesting adjective to describe the laughter. Does it perhaps convey a sense of the confusion that they create, this idea of the laughter sort of whirling around? Perhaps the speaker doesn't even understand why they're laughing. But either way, it creates, I think, quite a menacing impression. It's a sort of evil, terrifying laughter. In the third line of that second stanza, Joyce continues to create the impression that the army is a quite sort of terrifying, overwhelming force for this for the speaker of the poem. They cleave the gloom of dreams, a blinding flame, clanging upon the heart as upon an anvil. So what does the army do? Well, they cleave the gloom of dreams. The cleave is to cut. And so they somehow sort of are able to cut through the gloom of the speaker's dreams. And sort of linked to that, I suppose, and in contrast to that, they create a blinding flame. Now, the gloom of dreams that sort of cut apart, we might think of gloom as having negative connotations, but it's interesting here, the speaker sort of maybe seems to be hiding in the gloom of dreams when he's asleep. The darkness perhaps hides some of his negative emotions, some of the fear he feels, and then light, which is often sort of seen as a source of joy or hope in poetry, here actually takes on rather negative connotations as well, because it's a blinding flame that he sees, and so we might think about the effect of this and the way that actually the gloom of dreams seems to be an escape for the speaker, something for him to kind of escape into, but actually what this army brings about is a sort of a blinding light. And then we have the image at the end of that second stanza, which relates to the picture in the middle at the bottom of your screen. Again, talking about the army and the way that they are clanging upon the heart as upon an anvil. So we get again a sense of the army's power and the sheer sort of destructive nature of the army as it attacks. And obviously clanging is quite an interesting onomatopoeic word. It sort of sounds a bit like what it is describing, and Joyce also repeats it, so we have a sort of a double clanging here, giving a real sense of how overwhelming these sounds are as the army attacks. Probably worth taking a moment now to consider what the army is, what does it perhaps represent. So, obviously we could read this fairly straightforwardly as a poem about a man who has a nightmare about an attacking army. But maybe we could sort of try to think about it a little more sort of symbolically and consider whether this army represents something. Does it maybe symbolize some of his sort of negative thoughts and emotions and the way that those can overwhelm him? So let's take a quick look as well at the rhyme scheme here. So they kind of like their battle name and whirling laughter, flame, anvil. So name, laughter, flame, anvil. So we can see here the first and third lines rhyme, but then the second and fourth, laughter, anvil, really don't. So the rhyme scheme, which was more or less intact in that first stanza, is starting to break down a little bit here. And again, we might think, well, why is that significant? Does it perhaps sort of mirror the way that the speaker's own sort of sense of self is being slowly broken down by this onslaught from an attacking army? Might be one way of thinking about that. Certainly we'd consider why the speaker mentions that the army is sort of clanging upon his heart as upon an anvil. Heart obviously often associated with ideas of love, and this is something that really is coming through, I think, in the third stanza as well, that this perhaps is an expression of heartbreak, of loss, of deep sadness as well. So he says, the speaker says in the third stanza, they come, so again referring to the army, they come shaking in triumph. Okay, and again we might sort of connect that image of them being in triumph with their whirling laughter in the second stanza, with their arrogance in the first stanza. So they come shaking in triumph, their long green hair. They come out of the sea and run shouting by the shore. So again, quite a lot of interesting things to look at here. Firstly, we've got that, again, powerful verb of them shaking in triumph. Are they perhaps a little bit sort of deranged? Are they so confident in their victory that they're so excited by it that they're almost shaking with the anticipation of their victory, of defeating this poor person who's sort of seeing them in his nightmare. And notice as well the visual descriptions here, their long green hair. Is Joyce somehow implying that this army has got some kind of supernatural or at least unnatural element to it? The green hair creates quite a kind of barbaric image perhaps as well, this long green hair. And not only that, but they come out of the sea. So are they even human, or are they in some ways perhaps sort of, I kind of get the image of a kind of half amphibious almost, these half amphibious creatures sort of coming out of the sea. There's no sort of escaping them, and they run shouting by the shore. Again, very, very sort of striking auditory imagery. This is a very loud poem. And then in the final two lines, the speaker asks these sort of rhetorical questions, which I really think help clarify that this is a poem that, yes, appears to be about an army, but in fact is dealing with something a little bit more, and that the army represents a sort of series of negative emotions. Because the speaker asks, "My heart, have you no wisdom thus to despair?" So thus meaning here in this way. So my heart, have you no wisdom to despair in this fashion? Okay, despair, obviously quite a powerful word, this sense of sort of complete hopelessness that the speaker feels now after having been sort of overwhelmed by this vision of the oncoming attacking army. So if in the penultimate line he was addressing himself, in the final line the speaker seems to be addressing somebody who he loves, but perhaps who has left him. He says, "My love, my love, my love, why have you left me alone?" Conveying perhaps his feelings of sadness, confusion, despair. And you'll notice as well that Joyce repeats that phrase 3 times at the start of the line. My love, my love, my love, really emphasizing the speaker's focus on his lost love, and all of the powerful negative emotions that have been stirred up in him as a result. So just to finish up, I'm going to put a few annotations on here which might be of use when you're writing about this poem. So first thing to say is that we could argue, I think, that the whole poem becomes an extended metaphor. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what that means. So obviously we know what a metaphor is. It's when you describe one thing in terms of another thing, or describe it as something else, which it isn't literally. And an extended metaphor is something which takes that concept and as the name suggests, sort of extends it. So here we could say that the metaphor at the heart of this poem is that the army is a metaphor for the speaker's sort of negative emotions that he feels, and it becomes an extended metaphor because this idea runs throughout the whole poem. So all the descriptions of the army, yes, they are descriptions of an army, but perhaps this army itself represents something else, represents the speaker's feelings of sadness and despair. Okay, and then just last of all, I'm going to add in a couple of additional annotations which recap some of the things we've talked about so far. So here an army charging upon the land, and the thunder forces plunging. So charging, plunging, both very sort of powerful verbs that convey the sense of the army's power. The metaphor of the sound of the horses galloping being like thunder, obviously, also adds to that sense of the army's power. We have the connotations of death, perhaps, in the colour of the armour. We've talked about the significance of the army being arrogant as well, and the way that perhaps connects up with the whirling laughter in the second stanza, and the shaking and triumph in the third stanza. Whirling laughter, we talked about perhaps the confusion that the speaker feels as he hears this army. It's whirling, sort of swirling, can't kind of get a grip on anything. It's confusing him and terrifying him. We talked as well perhaps about how the blinding flame could link to that. If you're blinded, momentarily, again, it's that sense of sort of confusion. Where am I? What's going on? And that seems to be the experience of the speaker. He's completely overwhelmed. We mentioned as well the repetition here, the clanging, and the way that the onomatopoeia really emphasizes the sound made by the army. Shaking and triumph, the long green hair. We talked about how the long green hair might sort of signify in some way that there's a kind of unnatural quality to this army, even a sort of alien nature to them. Perhaps also reinforced by the idea of them coming out of the sea. And then the 2 questions at the end. It's worth noting that this first one seems to be a sort of rhetorical question which the speaker is addressing to himself. Have you no wisdom thus to despair? Some sort of wisdom that would protect him from these negative emotions, but he seems not to be able to do that. And then again, this sort of triple repetition at the end: my love, my love, my love, really emphasizing how the speaker feels towards this absent person. Why have you left me alone? And again, that question sort of directed towards perhaps this lost love, and signalling the speaker's feelings of sadness and confusion at this abandonment. Okay, hopefully that was a useful recap of I Hear an Army. If you have any specific questions, or if anything about it is not clear, then feel free to put a comment underneath the video, and someone from the English department will aim to get back to you.